Chapter 2. Meeting Chairman Mao. In my role as the Dalai Lama, I was trying to mitigate the disaster for my people. On October 26, 1951, approximately 3,000 troops from the People's Liberation Army's 18th Route Army entered Lhasa. Soon after, a further large detachment of soldiers arrived, and combined with a large influx of horses, this led to a serious food shortage. Lhasa, in 1951, had a local population of just over 30,000, so one can imagine the impact of such a massive influx of Chinese troops in the city. This situation came to worsen further as thousands of Tibetans came as refugees from eastern Tibet. The period between 1951 and 1959 proved to be one of the most challenging times of my life. In part, I was still studying intensively for my final Geshe-l-Haram degree. Geshe-l-Haram is the highest academic degree one can obtain within the formal scholarly training of the great monastic universities of the Gelug school, analogous to a doctorate in divinity, which would culminate in February 1959. In part, I was going through a massive learning curve as a young man in the complexities of politics, having received no formal training in any of these matters. Of course, the rigorous education I was receiving in Buddhist philosophy and psychology did help me immensely in maintaining my sanity against the complex political challenges I had no choice but to face as the leader of the Tibetan people. And my on-the-job education meant dealing with the very real disagreements between my government and the Chinese generals who were stationed in Lhasa and had all the guns. I was often caught between the extremely reluctant and at times confrontational Tibetan officials on the one hand and the increasing heavy-handedness and haughty attitudes of the Chinese generals on the other. Ultimately, in 1952, my two prime ministers, one lay and one monastic, were forced to resign by the Chinese. I made the decision not to appoint replacements to these posts since they would simply be scapegoats, and it was better that I accept the responsibilities myself. The situation in Lhasa was getting more tense by the day. I also still had to govern, and one of my priorities was to improve our system and society. I set up a reform committee to help create a more equitable system with explicit attention paid to the needs of the ordinary people and the poor. As a child growing up, I learned a lot from sweepers at my residence, who were often my playmates, about the problem of injustice and abuse by the powerful. But I faced major obstacles from the Chinese since they wanted reforms according to their own system, along lines introduced in mainland China. They probably felt that if changes were initiated by the Tibetans themselves, it might hinder their own agenda. So, when in 1954 the Chinese government invited me to Beijing, I felt it was the only option left to me to attempt to improve my people's deteriorating situation. In June, I received a telegram from Deng Xiaoping, then the senior figure responsible for Tibetan affairs in the Chinese leadership, inviting me to attend the inaugural National People's Congress in Beijing in September 1954. The same invitation was extended to the Panchen Lama. Although the Tibetans in Lhasa were deeply concerned about my trip to Beijing, I decided that it was best that I go for the sake of my people. To assuage their fear, during a large gathering of Tibetans at a religious ceremony at Norbulinka, my summer residence, I reassured them and promised to be back within a year. To this day, I remember when I left Lhasa for Beijing, there were so many people crying. I heard some of the older women shouting, "Please don't go. It would be not good." As there was no bridge over the Kichu River at the time, we had to cross it in the traditional Tibetan coracles, made out of yak hide stretched over a willow frame. On the sides of the river, there were so many people crying. Some even seemed they might jump into the river. Later, I heard that some fainted and even died. On September 4th, 1954, Panchen Lama and I, with our delegations, finally arrived in Beijing by train from Xi'an. We were received at the station by Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, Vice Chairman Zhu, who was also the Commander-in-Chief of the People's Liberation Army and a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and other Chinese officials. A few days later, I met Chairman Mao Zedong himself for the first time. He was 61 years old to my 19. He was warm and welcoming. This meeting, joined by other top leaders, including Zhou Enlai and Liu Shaoqi, took place at the House of Reception, a former imperial garden adjacent to the Forbidden City, and later transformed into a compound that houses government offices as well as residences for senior leadership. The setting of this meeting was quite majestic, with its opulent imperial legacy unmistakable. Here we were, myself only 19 years old, and the Panchen Lama 16 years old, in a formal meeting with Chairman Mao himself, flanked by Communist China's most senior leaders. That we felt awed and somewhat nervous would be an understatement. At this first meeting, only Chairman Mao and I spoke. Mao said that he and the central government were very happy about my first visit to Beijing, and that the relationship between Chinese and Tibetans was very important. He also assured me that in the future, the central government would make great efforts to help develop Tibet. On my part, I responded to Mao, saying I was very happy to have the opportunity to meet him and other leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. The meeting lasted about an hour. As we left, Mao and other leaders accompanied us out of the house, and Mao himself opened the car door for me. As I was getting into the car, Mao shook my hand and said, "Your coming to Beijing is coming back to your own home. Whenever you come to Beijing, you can call on me. Don't be shy. If you need anything, just tell me directly." I came out of that meeting impressed with Mao and encouraged at the possibility that things could improve in Tibet. With me in the car was Phunsok Wangyal, a rare Tibetan communist, who was my official interpreter during my stay in Beijing. I was so relieved that this first meeting with Mao and other Chinese leaders went well. In fact, I hugged Phunsok Wangyal and told him that Mao was truly unlike anyone I had met. The success of this first meeting also reassured my Tibetan entourage, including especially my senior tutor, Ling Rinpoche, who had been feeling quite worried about me. Phunsok Wangyal was a true believer in communism in its original Marxist internationalist sense, and at the time he believed, later to his disappointment, that the Chinese communists also shared this internationalist vision of Marxism. Decades later, when Phunsok Wangyal was allowed to visit Europe, I was able to speak with him by phone. I asked him, "What happened to your dream of true socialism?" He just laughed. On September 16th, I addressed the First National People's Congress, noting that the draft Constitution of the People's Republic of China states, in particular, that all nationalities may draw up their rules governing the exercise of autonomy and separate regulations in accordance with the special features of the development, so that they can exercise full autonomy. By then, I had been made a vice president of the steering committee of the People's Republic of China. During my stay in Beijing, I had several meetings with Mao and other leaders, including Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. In Beijing, I was introduced to a number of senior international leaders as well, including the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, and the Burmese Prime Minister U Nu. Whenever I had some free time, I also took classes from my senior tutor Ling Rinpoche on the philosophically dense insight section of Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment. Technically, I was still a student, studying for my Geshe Laram exams. One memorable experience of my stay in Beijing included the conducting of a formal Buddhist teaching, in fact, an important initiation ceremony of a meditation practice known as Vajrabhairava to an assembly of Chinese Buddhists who were followers of Tibetan Buddhism. My translator at this teaching was the Chinese monk Fa Tsun, who informed me that he was working on a Tibetan translation of a major Buddhist philosophical text, great treatise on differentiation, Mahavibhasha, a 2nd century work extant only in Chinese translation. By then, Fa Tsun had already translated a major Tibetan work entitled The Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment by the 14th century master Tsongkhapa. Then I went on an arranged tour of cities within China, such as Tianjin, to see the way in which the communist government had industrially developed the country. Phunsok Wangyal was assigned as my translator during this tour, and I was accompanied also by another communist cadre by the name of Liu Geping, a member of the ethnic Hui Muslim minority. I met many party members of different ranks, some veterans of the revolution, and many very sincere communists. Incidentally, one of these was Xi Zhongxun, father of the current Chinese leader Xi Jinping. He had an affable personality and seemed quite broad-minded. I really liked him. I was told that he treasured all his life a wristwatch I had given him at the time. I was impressed by the sense of purpose and dedication displayed by many of these first-generation revolutionaries, as well as their obvious successes in their attempt to create a more egalitarian society. I learned much about Marxism-Leninism and was particularly struck by the emphasis in Marxist economic theory on equal distribution of resources rather than pure profit-making. The idea of taking care of the less privileged people of the working class is wonderful. To oppose all exploitation and to strive for a society without national boundaries, these are excellent ideals. As I was exposed to all this in my youth, these aspects of socialist thinking left a strong impression, such that I sometimes describe myself as half Buddhist and half Marxist. However, as I have thought about it over the years, what is lacking in Marxism is compassion. Its greatest flaw is the total neglect of basic human values and the deliberate promotion of hate through class struggle. Furthermore, as time went on, in the case of communist China, Marxism seemed to have given way to Leninism, with state control of the people by the party as the primary objective. During this tour around China, I had the rare opportunity to cross into Inner Mongolia for a brief visit. It was a moving experience, given the long and close association between Tibetans and Mongols spiritually. Although for me, this tour of Chinese cities was educational and enjoyable, most of my officials, including my 2 tutors, were completely uninterested. So when it was announced that there was going to be no more sightseeing, there was a collective sigh of relief. My mother in particular did not enjoy her stay in China, especially the hectic sightseeing schedule. At one point, she even got ill with a serious case of flu. Since my return to Beijing from the tour was close to Losar, Tibetan New Year, I decided to host a banquet and extend invitations to Chairman Mao and the other 3 senior Chinese leaders, Zhou Enlai, Zhu Dei, and Liu Shaoqi. They all accepted, and we had a memorable celebration. One day, Chairman Mao paid an unannounced visit to my lodgings. During this meeting, he unexpectedly asked if Tibet had a national flag. Somewhat nervously, I replied that we did, and he said that it would be fine for us to keep it. Mao's surprising response implied that, at that time at least, he had in mind a model of the diverse nations within the People's Republic along the lines of the republics within the Soviet Union. In fact, I know Mao gave orders to senior Chinese officials stationed in Tibet at the time, Zhang Jingwu, Zhang Guohua, and Fan Ming, to display the Tibetan flag alongside China's Red Star and also my photo alongside his own. So later, in exile, when Tibetans and international Tibetan supporters would display our national flag in public, especially when greeting me during international travels, I used to tell them that Mao himself had given permission to keep our flag. Today, sadly, the Tibetan flag is illegal in Tibet, and anyone caught in possession of it will go to prison. Before I left Beijing, I had a final meeting with Mao. He looked very happy and told me to communicate directly with him through the telegraph, saying I should train some trusted Tibetans to do this. He then came close to me and said, "Your mind is scientific, and that is very good. I have watched your thinking and activities all these months. Your mind is a very revolutionary mind." He gave me excellent practical advice about government, and I took notes. As the meeting came to a close, Mao told me, "Your attitude is good, you know. Religion is poison. It reduces the population because the monks and nuns must stay celibate, and it neglects material progress." I was shaken and attempted to hide my feelings by leaning forward as if to write something. It was then I knew, despite all the hints of positive dialogue, that he was the destroyer of Buddha Dharma. As I prepared for my journey back home to Lhasa in March 1955, despite Mao's last disconcerting comment about religion, I still had hopes of saving my people from the worst consequences of the Chinese occupation. I thought my 6-month visit to China had helped in 2 ways. It had shown me exactly what we were up against and had appeared to have persuaded the Chinese leaders not to go ahead with their original plan of governing Tibet directly from Beijing through a military and political committee. We seemed to have a firm promise of autonomy. In fact, on the way back to Tibet, I met the Chinese General Zhang Guohua, who was stationed in Lhasa but was en route to Beijing. I told him that on my way to China I was full of anxiety, but now on my way back home I felt more hopeful and confident. So I had some faith that we could work with the Chinese. Tibet could be modernized, and its people would live on some kind of equal terms with the Chinese majority within the People's Republic of China. I worked earnestly to seek a lasting accommodation that would save my nation and people within the constraints of the 17-point agreement. I tried to institute some reforms, notably to establish an independent judiciary, to encourage proposals for the development of a program of modern education, and to build modern roads. It proved to be a hopeless task, constantly undermined by the Chinese Communist military and civil officials stationed in Tibet, with rising resentment of repression and the risk of spontaneous revolt from the Tibetan people. My efforts were blocked at every stage by the Chinese officials and military. The Preparatory Committee for the Autonomous Region of Tibet, PCART, which was meant to give the Tibetans autonomy over the process of reform, and of which I was the chair, turned out to be just a show, with all actual power in the hands of the Chinese. The promises and assurances received in Beijing turned out to be empty. My messages to Mao elicited no response. During the many disasters and unspeakable acts against Tibetans that were to follow, I wrote 3 times to Chairman Mao, the 3rd time ensuring that my letter was personally delivered. There was never an answer. Whatever little hope I had in Mao and the communist leadership was shattered. The commitments that the Communist Party of China had made in the agreement it had forced upon us turned out to have no real meaning at all.